let's leave it there and move to Gilles, who's been patiently waiting. So Gilles Dufrasne here from Carbon Market Watch, where he's policy officer focused on carbon pricing, both at the EU level and international level. Gilles, do you want to tell us what your views are on the negotiations and what needs to be in this deal?
Yeah, thanks, Sonia, and thanks everyone for the good input already. I think I'll just try to go over five key issues that we think are quite important in our views, and some of them have been discussed already, but I'll try to give an overview on each of them. So the first issue is that, as has been said, we need to make sure that we don't rely on old emission reductions to meet new targets. So what we need are new emission reductions and not some accounting tricks to make our efforts look good on paper, of course. So we can't really rely on credits that were generated before 2020 because we want the market to incentivize new projects and new emission reductions. If we look a bit at the numbers, we see that the CDM alone could bring 4 billion credits from the past back into the market, and that would allow an increase in emissions of about 4 gigatons of CO2, because the credit is usually one ton of CO2 equivalent. And obviously, given the state of emergency we are at and the lack of ambition in NDCs at the moment, as has been said already, we really cannot afford to bring 4 gigatons of CO2 into the Paris Agreement from the past. The second issue is that of double counting, and maybe just to try to explain in very simple words, perhaps not with all the technical details and specificities of the issues, but double counting occurs because when emissions are reduced in a country, then this country is going to report a lower level of emissions. That makes sense because, well, emissions have been reduced. And the issue arises when these emission reductions are sold to another country, which is then also reporting a lower total level of emissions, because then you have two entities, in this case, two countries, reporting lower emissions, even though there's only one single ton that has been reduced. And so when we talk about avoiding double counting, what we need to do is actually quite logical. It's just common sense. We need to have a correction to the level of emissions which is reported by countries to take into account the fact that some of the emission reductions have been sold and have been used by a country which is not the country where they took place. Of course, when you start looking at the details and how to do it in some specific cases, it can get quite technical, but the underlying issue is really quite more of a logic problem. Now, the third issue is has been discussed already by MJ in quite a lot of detail. It's the question of how we go beyond what we call pure offsetting, or the way we've been using carbon markets until now as a zero-sum game, where a country is buying a carbon credit from another country and is using this to essentially justify an emission in, well, a domestic emission. And so carbon markets in that way can be seen also as a way of reducing efforts domestically. So instead of being used to increase ambition, you're actually using markets to reduce your own efforts at home. So I guess it's quite a different view from what Stefano was presenting at the moment. If markets are used in this way, then the overall result is that you have no change in emissions. It's a zero-sum game, and we really cannot afford that anymore under the Paris Agreement, because we know NDCs collectively do not bring us to the 2-degree target, let alone 1.5. And so we need a market or a system that brings us extra emission reductions that are not counted by any entity, any country. And this requires that some of the emission reductions, well, as I said, are not counted, and so some of the credits be cancelled or be partially cancelled, and the host country still applying corresponding adjustments. So we really need a system that goes beyond just offsetting. The fourth point I don't think has been mentioned yet is the question of avoiding that markets have negative impacts on local communities. Sadly, we've seen that in the past, especially under the CDM, some projects have had adverse impacts on local communities, and in some cases even infringed on human rights. And this simply has to stop. I mean, it's not a complicated market design question. It's purely political, and it's really unacceptable if countries were to not be able to stand behind strong rules to protect local communities. Specifically, we need a mechanism through which stakeholders can register complaints if they're affected by a project. And we need local stakeholder consultations to make sure that stakeholders are included in projects and can benefit from projects. Now, I think all countries agreed to the SDGs, to the Sustainable Development Goals. So there's really no reason why these should not also be promoted and reflected within carbon markets. And then finally, last but not least, we need to realize that the difficult situation we are in now with a large amount of existing credits, in this case from the CDM, threatening to undermine future climate ambition is not actually so unique. A similar situation happened when we transitioned between the two commitment periods of the Kyoto Protocol. There was a large supply of AAUs at the time, another type of unit. And if we don't adopt rules today, we will end up in a very similar situation in the future when we transition between NDC periods. Because the problem is that many NDCs are very weak. And so if countries are allowed to generate credits when they overachieve their targets, then it will essentially be very easy for several countries to issue a lot of credits because the targets are very easy to reach. And so it's also very easy to overachieve those targets. And so to issue credits without actually doing, implementing much climate ambition. And so we really need to adopt limits. It could be on the number of units that can be generated.
Start wrapping up, Gilles.
Yeah, I'm wrapping up. It can be on the number of units generated or on the lifetime of each unit, but we really need to have measures to avoid that new hot air accumulates within the Paris Agreement. So these are the 5 issues that I wanted to cover here.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.